What happens when a king defies his own people? When religious zeal, royal ambition, and revolutionary fervor ignite a nation already on the brink? Welcome to one of the most turbulent chapters in British history, the English Civil War. In a time when monarchs ruled by divine right and dissent was treason, a conflict erupted that would see family members on opposing sides of the battlefield, entire cities under siege, and a king ultimately tried and executed by his own subjects. This gripping story spans rebellion, betrayal, and a revolution that reshaped the monarchy forever. Get ready to journey through epic battles, political intrigue, and unshakable convictions that tore a kingdom apart. If you're captivated by tales of power, defiance, and dramatic history, don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Stories TV. Join us as we bring history's most defining moments to life, one vivid tale at a time. In the early decades of the 1600s, England appeared stable on the surface. The monarchy stood firm, the church had weathered reformations, and the kingdom's borders were at peace. But beneath that calm exterior, trouble was building. Political unrest simmered across the realm. Religious divisions deepened year after year. By the time war broke out, the causes had already been smoldering for decades. Politically, the balance of power was shifting. Parliament was becoming stronger, more assertive. It no longer accepted that the king could rule alone. More and more members demanded that laws, taxes, and decisions should require their approval. They wanted accountability from the crown. But not all agreed with this direction. There were still many who believed the king had been chosen by God himself. For them, Parliament's resistance looked like rebellion. At the same time, religion became a battlefield of ideas. England was a Protestant country, but Protestantism came in many forms. The Church of England, led by bishops and officially tied to the crown, remained dominant. But Puritan voices were growing louder. These reformers wanted to strip away anything they saw as too Catholic. Ornate churches, stained glass, choral music, all were under attack from Puritans who favored plain, sober worship. They believed the Reformation was unfinished, and they saw compromise as betrayal. Religious conflict wasn't confined to debates among clergy. It reached into every village, into every home. What prayers were said on Sunday could now define who you were politically. Was your minister preaching obedience to the king or calling for reform? Did your church display symbols that reminded neighbors of Rome? These questions divided communities. In many towns, people stopped speaking to one another. In others, they took up weapons. These tensions were magnified by rumors and fear. Many believed the king secretly favored Catholicism. Others were convinced that Parliament was being infiltrated by radicals. Foreign wars between Catholic and Protestant powers in Europe added to the anxiety. If a religious war could sweep across the continent, could it happen in England too? By the 1630s, the tension was no longer just spiritual or political. It was personal. People began choosing sides. Some supported the monarchy and defended tradition. Others aligned with Parliament, calling for change. Still others wanted something even more radical, a new kind of England without bishops or kings. The country began to fracture. Friends argued over Sunday sermons. Landowners clashed with ministers. And families were split between loyalty to the crown and sympathy for Parliament. The king didn't help ease the tension. He ruled without parliament for over a decade, making decisions alone. He raised taxes without consent. He punished critics without trials. Many saw this as tyranny. Others saw it as necessary strength. Across the country, resentment grew. When war came, it would not be over a single law or a single moment. It would be a war about identity, about who England really was. Still, there was hope that the kingdom might hold together. There were efforts at negotiation. There were attempts to find compromise, but neither side trusted the other. Every concession seemed like a trap. Every proposal was viewed with suspicion. And while political leaders argued in Westminster, violence began to spark in the countryside. Scotland rebelled over religious reforms. Ireland exploded into revolt, fueled by years of colonial tension. The king needed money to put down the unrest. But to get money, he had to recall Parliament. And when Parliament returned, they came with demands, strong ones. They wanted reform. They wanted limits on royal power. They wanted justice. The king resisted. He saw their conditions as an insult, a threat to his authority. And then, when he tried to arrest members of Parliament by force, the last fragile hope of peace vanished. Militias were raised. Weapons were gathered. Cities declared allegiance to one side or the other. Parliament called its supporters to arms. The king raised his royal standard and summoned loyal subjects to join him. What had begun as debate had become confrontation. Now it would become war. This was not a foreign conflict. It was not a war against another nation. It was a war of Englishmen against Englishmen, sons against fathers, neighbors against neighbors. And it would not be short, nor clean, nor easy. It would stretch for years. It would leave cities ruined. It would cost thousands of lives. And it would lead to the unthinkable, the trial and execution of a king. The English Civil War did not begin in a single moment. It was not the result of a single cause. It was a perfect storm of fear, faith, power, and pride. It was the product of a country that could no longer agree on who should lead, how they should worship, or what kind of nation they wanted to be. At the center of it all stood one man, King Charles I. His beliefs, his decisions, and his refusal to bend would push the nation toward the edge. And from that point on, nothing would ever be the same. At the heart of the English Civil War stood a king who saw himself not merely as a ruler, but as a servant of divine authority. Charles I believed that his right to rule came not from Parliament, nor the people, but directly from God. This belief, the divine right of kings, was more than political theory. For Charles, it was truth, unshakable, sacred, and it shaped every decision he made from policy to war. He had been raised in a world that revered monarchy as God's order on earth. His father, James I, had also embraced divine right, but Charles took it even further. He saw any challenge to his rule as a challenge to God's will. Parliament's demands were not just disagreements, they were offenses against heaven. To yield to such demands in his mind would be an act of weakness and betrayal of the sacred office he held. This belief made compromise almost impossible. When Parliament asked for more say in taxes or military decisions, Charles felt insulted. When critics questioned his policies, he felt threatened. To Charles, there was a proper order to the world. Kings ruled, subjects obeyed, and God watched over it all. But England was changing. Parliament was no longer a passive advisory council. It had become a force of its own. And Charles didn't like what he saw. Even his tone, his body language, and his speeches reflected this belief. He carried himself with regal formality. He avoided public displays of emotion. He saw himself as above the political fray. When Parliament called him to negotiate, he often responded coldly or not at all. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction. In his eyes, no earthly institution had the authority to restrain him. Only God could judge a king. But this unwavering faith in divine authority led him into dangerous territory. Instead of building bridges with Parliament, Charles burned them. Instead of listening to advisors who warned of rising unrest, he dismissed them. And instead of sharing power during times of crisis, he clung to it more tightly than ever. These decisions isolated him. They turned potential allies into enemies and moderate critics into fierce opponents. One of the earliest signs of conflict came over money. War was expensive. The crown was in debt. Parliament had long been the traditional source of funds, but they wanted oversight in return. Charles refused. He believed Parliament's role was to give, not to question, so he ruled without them. For over a decade, from 1629 to 1640, Charles governed alone in a period known as the personal rule. During this time, he imposed taxes without consent. He used old feudal laws to raise funds. He sold monopolies and revived outdated fines. To those who paid these dues, it felt like extortion. To Charles, it was necessary. The crown needed revenue. Parliament had refused. And as king, he had every right to act. But even more dangerous than his financial policies were his religious choices. Charles saw the Church of England as a pillar of royal authority. He supported bishops' rituals and hierarchy, all symbols of order and control. His chief religious advisor, Archbishop Laud, pushed reforms that emphasized formality, ceremony, and obedience. These reforms reminded many of Catholic practices which frightened Protestant hardliners. For Puritans, Laud's actions were a betrayal of the Reformation. Instead of reassuring his Protestant subjects, Charles seemed to drift closer to Catholicism. He married Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess. He allowed Catholic advisors into his inner circle. He celebrated holy days that Puritans despised. These choices deepened suspicions. Was the king secretly plotting to restore Catholicism in England? Was he using the church to suppress religious freedom? In truth, Charles was not a Catholic. He never converted. But he believed deeply in unity and order, and Catholicism, with its structure and reverence, appealed to that instinct. His refusal to allow religious pluralism was not driven by malice, but by a fear that too many voices would lead to chaos. Yet, ironically, his desire for control only created more disorder. As resistance to his rule grew, Charles refused to bend. He did not believe a king should bend. When Parliament offered petitions and lists of grievances, he dismissed them. When protests broke out, he sent soldiers. When criticism grew louder, he censored it. Each time he chose force over dialogue, he pushed the nation closer to the brink. And then, in 1642, he made a fateful choice. After years of rising conflict, Charles marched into the House of Commons with armed guards intending to arrest 5 members of Parliament. The act shocked the country. It violated centuries of custom. It made civil war seem not just likely, but inevitable. The 5 men had already escaped, but the message was clear: the king was prepared to rule by force. In the streets of London, crowds turned against him. Parliament seized control of the city. Across England, loyalties split. Towns and counties chose sides. Some raised banners for the king, others for Parliament. What Charles had hoped would restore his authority instead destroyed it. Even then, he did not abandon his beliefs. As war began, he saw himself not as an aggressor, but as a defender of rightful rule. He wrote letters insisting he had acted with justice. He surrounded himself with loyal nobles who shared his view, and he hoped until the very end that his enemies would come to their senses, that God would vindicate his cause. But the world had changed. The England of Charles I was no longer the England of his father. New voices demanded a new kind of leadership. Parliament was no longer a tool. It was a rival. The people no longer saw kings as unquestionable. They saw them as human. And Charles, though brave and intelligent, could not adapt. His deep belief in divine right gave him strength, but it also blinded him. It led him to underestimate his opponents, overreach his power, and misunderstand the country he ruled. In time, that belief would cost him everything: his crown, his kingdom, and his life. For a kingdom already torn by religious tension, the king's choice of bride sent shockwaves through England. In 1625, Charles I married Henrietta Maria of France, a young devout Roman Catholic princess. To many English subjects, the announcement was not a celebration. It was a warning. A Protestant king had joined himself to the Catholic daughter of France's monarch. The timing could not have been worse. England was officially Protestant, but suspicion of Catholicism still ran deep. Memories of bloody religious conflict were not distant. Just a few generations earlier, England had broken away from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII. In the years since, fear of Catholic plots, papal interference, and foreign influence had become ingrained in the national psyche. The Spanish Armada, the Gunpowder Plot, and centuries of European religious wars had left scars. Catholics were viewed not just as religious others, but as political threats. So when Charles chose a Catholic queen, people questioned his loyalty. Would Henrietta Maria influence him toward Rome? Would she raise their children as Catholics? Would Catholic advisors flood the court and quietly steer policy behind the scenes? For many, the answer seemed obvious and dangerous. At first, the marriage was presented as a diplomatic triumph. France was a powerful ally. A royal union would strengthen bonds and deter aggression from Spain or other Catholic powers. On paper, the alliance made strategic sense. But politics is rarely just about paper. In practice, the marriage deepened England's internal fractures. Henrietta Maria did not convert. She kept her Catholic faith, brought priests with her to court, and maintained her own chapel for Mass. For Protestant England, this was intolerable. The Queen's open Catholic worship became a symbol of everything Parliament feared. Her household included French servants, Catholic advisors, and even Jesuit confessors. She reportedly refused to attend Anglican services. Instead of winning hearts, Henrietta Maria was met with whispers, rumors, and cold receptions. Political pamphlets accused her of manipulating the king. Puritan sermons warned of Catholic infiltration. Some accused her of plotting to restore papal rule to England. Charles, in turn, defended her fiercely. He loved her deeply, perhaps more than any English king had loved his queen in generations. He protected her interests, respected her beliefs, and gave her a degree of freedom uncommon for a royal consort. But his devotion only fueled the flames. Parliament saw his loyalty to his wife as weakness, or worse, as shared sympathy for Catholicism. As Parliament pressed for stricter anti-Catholic laws, Charles resisted. He refused to persecute Catholics more harshly. He allowed Henrietta Maria's chapel to remain open. He protected her priests even when Parliament demanded their removal. To him, this was a matter of dignity, of protecting his wife and the honor of the crown. To his critics, it was evidence of betrayal. Meanwhile, public perception of the Queen worsened. Cartoons depicted her as a dark force behind the throne. Rumors claimed she was communicating secretly with foreign powers. Some accused her of conspiring with the Pope. Even minor court decisions were attributed to her supposed influence. Every time Charles made an unpopular move, the Queen was blamed. Her foreign birth, foreign faith, and private circle made her an easy scapegoat. Henrietta Maria, for her part, grew increasingly frustrated. She felt isolated, resented, and misunderstood. She clashed with members of Charles's court. She struggled to form connections with English nobles, many of whom refused to deal with her at all. In private letters, she lamented her loneliness and the coldness of her adopted country. In time, the Queen began to take a more active role in royal politics, especially as tensions with Parliament escalated. She urged Charles not to yield. She supported strong actions to defend the crown. She became a voice for resistance within the court. Some praised her courage. Others saw her as a dangerous influence, pushing the king toward confrontation rather than compromise. By the late 1630s, the mistrust toward the royal couple had grown deeper. Parliament was no longer simply wary, it was openly hostile. The Queen's Catholicism was no longer a background concern. It was seen as part of a larger threat, a plot to reshape England's religion, government, and identity. And because Charles defended her at every turn, the king himself became inseparable from the suspicion. This mistrust had real consequences. When the Irish Rebellion broke out in 1641, where Irish Catholics rose up against Protestant English settlers, many in Parliament were quick to draw lines back to the Queen. Some even believed she had secretly encouraged the uprising. There was no evidence. But in an age of fear and division, facts mattered less than perceptions. And the perception was clear: the Queen could not be trusted. When civil war finally broke out, Henrietta Maria's position became even more dangerous. Parliament declared her an enemy of the state. Her movements were tracked. Her letters were intercepted. She eventually fled to France, raising funds and weapons for the royalist cause from abroad. To her, she was fighting for her husband and the crown. To her enemies, she was a foreign agent waging war against the English people. In the end, her role in the conflict was deeply personal and deeply political. She was not the cause of the war, but she became one of its symbols, a Catholic queen at the center of a Protestant kingdom's crisis, a wife whose love and influence helped shape a king's stubborn resolve, a foreign princess who never found a place among her people. Henrietta Maria's marriage to Charles was meant to strengthen the monarchy. Instead, it helped unravel it. It intensified suspicion, hardened Parliament's resistance, and widened the gulf between king and country. And in the process, it helped push England further down the road to war. If there was one issue that united the king's critics across all classes and creeds, it was money. More specifically, how Charles I collected it. In the absence of Parliament, which traditionally held the power to approve new taxes, Charles resorted to raising funds on his own terms. These decisions may have been legal by the letter of outdated feudal laws, but to the people of England, they felt arbitrary, heavy-handed, and unfair. What began as an effort to fund the monarchy without compromise quickly turned into one of the greatest sources of national resentment. The story began in 1629 when Charles dissolved Parliament and chose to rule without it. This period, often called the personal rule, lasted for 11 years. Without Parliament to grant him subsidies, Charles had to find other ways to finance his government, his court, and critically, his military ambitions. What followed was a series of creative but deeply unpopular financial schemes that tested the patience of landowners, merchants, and commoners alike. One of his most controversial moves was the expansion of ship money. Originally, this tax was only collected from coastal counties during times of war, specifically to fund the construction of ships to defend the nation. But Charles had a different idea. In 1634, he levied ship money during peacetime. Then a year later, he extended it to inland counties, places that had never been subject to it before. The justification: the king claimed that England was always at risk and that it was his royal prerogative to prepare for defense. But few people believed this reasoning. There was no immediate threat, no naval crisis, and no war on the horizon. To many, it felt like a thinly veiled cash grab. The backlash was swift and widespread. Landowners were outraged. Merchants protested. Local officials were caught between obeying royal orders and facing angry townspeople. One man in particular, John Hampden, a wealthy landowner and cousin of Oliver Cromwell, refused to pay. His case went to court, and though the verdict favored the king by a narrow margin, Hampden became a national hero. His defiance was seen as principled, courageous, and patriotic. Suddenly, resistance to royal taxation became a badge of honor. But ship money was just one part of the larger problem. Charles also revived forgotten medieval laws to squeeze more money from the population. He fined those who didn't accept knighthood, reviving an ancient law requiring landowners with property above a certain value to be knighted at the king's coronation. If they declined, they were fined. The law hadn't been enforced in generations. Now thousands were penalized for something they didn't even realize was required. Another tactic was granting monopolies. The crown would sell exclusive rights to trade or manufacture certain goods in exchange for a hefty fee. But these monopolies drove up prices and limited supply, hurting consumers and shutting out smaller merchants. One of the most notorious examples was the monopoly on soap. Critics called it popish soap because the company's leadership was Catholic. And to Protestants, that wasn't just bad business, it was a threat to their faith. Everywhere people looked, the king seemed to be inventing new ways to take their money. Fines were issued for building homes outside designated areas. Forest laws were resurrected to fine those who encroached on royal land. Loans were requested from the wealthy, and those who declined were imprisoned. the legal basis for these actions was murky at best. The moral basis, many argued, was non-existent. The resentment went beyond economics. These taxes weren't just seen as greedy, they were seen as tyrannical. They violated the long-standing English belief that taxation required consent. That belief had its roots in Magna Carta and had been reinforced for centuries. The king could not impose financial burdens without Parliament's approval. But Charles had bypassed that safeguard. To many, that made his actions not just unwise but unlawful. What made matters worse was how the taxes were enforced. Royal commissioners, often corrupt or overly aggressive, were sent into towns to collect money, seize goods, or levy fines. Their presence stirred anger and fear. People felt violated. They feared their homes would be searched, their property seized, or their neighbors turned against them. In a time when trust in government was already eroding, these enforcers became symbols of injustice. And yet, despite all the opposition, Charles remained firm. He saw these taxes as necessary and justified. He believed the crown had a sacred duty to maintain order and protect the realm, and that required money. Parliament had refused to cooperate. In his eyes, the burden fell on him alone. But this perspective ignored the rising tide of anger across his kingdom. Each new tax hardened resistance. Each fine or imprisonment bred new enemies. By the late 1630s, the economic pressure was reaching a breaking point. The wealthy were angry. The middle class was anxious. Even common farmers began to speak out. Public sentiment shifted. More and more people began to view the king not as a protector, but as an oppressor. Trust in royal authority crumbled. When rebellion broke out in Scotland over religious reforms, Charles needed even more money to fund a campaign. But this time the people had had enough. In 1640, he was forced to recall Parliament, hoping for funds. But Parliament came back with demands. They remembered every tax, every fine, every prison sentence, and they were ready to push back. Charles's choice to raise taxes without Parliament had solved short-term financial problems, but it had created a long-term political disaster. The resentment it bred didn't stay quiet. It didn't fade. It exploded into open defiance, fierce debates, and eventually open war. When King Charles I reconvened Parliament in 1628, it was not out of desire, it was out of necessity. His wars in Europe had drained the royal treasury, and his unpopular methods of collecting funds without parliamentary consent had triggered deep unrest. But this time, Parliament wasn't interested in funding his campaigns without conditions. Instead, they had something far more significant in mind, a document that would challenge the very foundation of royal power. That document became known as the Petition of Right. It was not just another list of grievances. It was a direct demand for legal limits on the king's authority limits that Charles had so far refused to recognize. Drafted primarily by Sir Edward Coke, a seasoned parliamentarian and legal scholar, the petition laid out 4 fundamental rights that Parliament insisted the king must respect. First, no taxes could be imposed without Parliament's approval. This was in direct response to Charles's widespread use of forced loans and other unauthorized levies. Second, no subject could be imprisoned without cause. This targeted the king's practice of jailing those who refused to pay without any formal charges or trials. Third, soldiers could not be billeted in private homes. Many citizens had been forced to house and feed soldiers against their will, an old grievance that echoed deep resentment. And finally, martial law could not be imposed during peacetime. Parliament feared the king's growing reliance on military power to silence dissent and enforce his will. At its core, the Petition of Right was a restatement of liberties that many believed had already been guaranteed by earlier documents like Magna Carta. But under Charles, these liberties had been trampled. Parliament wanted them reaffirmed not as optional courtesies, but as binding legal principles. When the petition was presented to Charles, he hesitated. To accept it would mean acknowledging limits to his rule. To reject it would mean losing vital funding. For a time, he tried to stall. He offered vague replies. He played with words, hoping to satisfy Parliament without binding himself. But they would not accept a half answer. Under mounting pressure, Charles eventually gave his formal assent. The moment he did, Parliament erupted in cheers. It felt like a victory, a moment of constitutional triumph. For once, the king had bowed to the law, not the other way around. But the celebration was short-lived. Charles may have signed the document, but he had no intention of honoring it. Almost immediately, he continued the very practices the petition had sought to end. He still imprisoned subjects without charges. He still demanded money without approval. He still ruled as if nothing had changed. And in doing so, he revealed something crucial about his character. He saw promises not as commitments, but as political tools. To many in Parliament, this was betrayal. They had believed the Petition of Right would mark a turning point. Instead, it became a symbol of the king's duplicity. Trust, already fragile, was shattered further. The belief that constitutional negotiation could rein in royal power began to fade. In its place grew a hardened resolve: if Charles would not respect legal agreements, then more forceful measures would be necessary. This growing tension found its voice in figures like John Pym, a passionate critic of the monarchy. Pym understood that Charles could not be trusted to self-limit. He called for accountability, for oversight, and for resistance. In many ways, Pym became the moral engine of the parliamentary cause. His speeches warned of a creeping tyranny. His arguments pointed to the Petition of Right as proof that the king's word meant little. More and more members of Parliament rallied to his side. The public also took notice. Pamphlets spread across the cities retelling the events. Sermons echoed Parliament's grievances. People in taverns and town squares began to question the king, not just his policies, but his integrity. The narrative shifted. Charles was no longer seen as a misunderstood monarch. He was increasingly viewed as a man who ruled by deception and arrogance. This shift in perception was crucial. The Petition of Right wasn't just a legal document. It became a rallying cry, a symbol of broken promises, a visible line between lawful authority and arbitrary rule, and it deepened the divide between crown and country. Frustrated by Parliament's criticism, Charles once again dissolved it in 1629. He would not call another for over a decade. This marked the beginning of his personal rule, a time when he governed without parliamentary input. Some called it a time of peace. Others called it the 11 Years' Tyranny. But even during this period, the memory of the Petition of Right lingered. It was reprinted, discussed, and used as evidence that the king had no interest in compromise. It became part of the national consciousness, proof that something had gone terribly wrong with the balance of power. Ironically, it would not be a military defeat or foreign invasion that would bring Charles back to Parliament. It would be money once again. When war broke out with Scotland over religious reforms, Charles's treasury collapsed. His methods of taxation were failing. The people refused to pay. And in 1640, with no other options left, Charles recalled Parliament. But this time, Parliament returned with a long memory and a long list of demands. The Petition of Right was no longer just a forgotten paper. It had become part of the resistance. It laid the foundation for further challenges to royal power. And in the years that followed, it would be cited again and again, not just by politicians, but by soldiers, poets, and revolutionaries. It had not stopped the king, but it had exposed him. It had proven that he could be pushed, pressured, and if necessary, opposed. And it marked a turning point in England's long road to civil war. The relationship between King Charles III and Parliament had always been uneasy. But after the Petition of Right, the trust between them broke completely. Parliament had expected change. Instead, they watched the king carry on as before, collecting taxes without consent, imprisoning his critics, and tightening his grip on church and state. The mood inside the House of Commons shifted. A wave of disillusionment spread among its members. Resentment hardened into resistance. Parliament, once willing to advise, began to challenge. Members who had previously been cautious now raised their voices. They brought motions to condemn the king's financial policies. They criticized his use of forced loans and ship money. They accused his advisors, especially those close to Queen Henrietta Maria, of pushing the country toward Catholicism and tyranny. One man became the loudest voice in the chamber, John Pym. Articulate, fearless, and unshakable in his principles, Pym emerged as a leader of the parliamentary opposition. He called for greater control over taxation. He demanded the removal of evil councillors. And most importantly, he insisted that Parliament, not the king, should hold final authority on major national decisions. These were not suggestions, they were declarations of power. To Charles, it was rebellion dressed in legal language. He saw Pym and his allies not as defenders of liberty, but as traitors to royal dignity. And he would not tolerate their defiance for long. The final spark came in 1629 when Parliament challenged the king's continued collection of customs duties, specifically tonnage and poundage, without their approval. Members demanded to debate it. Charles refused. When he ordered the Speaker of the House, Sir John Finch, to dissolve the session, something extraordinary happened. As Finch tried to rise from his chair to adjourn Parliament, several members physically held him down. They refused to let the session end. While he was pinned in his seat, resolutions were shouted across the chamber. The members declared that anyone collecting illegal taxes was a public enemy. They condemned the king's religious reforms. They passed motions of protest. The room erupted in cries of "Aye," as the speaker sat helpless, restrained by his own colleagues. It was an act of defiance unlike any in English parliamentary history. News of the incident shocked the court. Charles was enraged. To him, it was not a protest, it was an assault on royal authority. Within days, he formally dissolved Parliament, but he did not stop there. Several leading members, including those who had pinned the Speaker, were arrested and imprisoned. Some were fined. Others were held without trial. John Eliot, a prominent figure in the confrontation, died in prison 3 years later. This marked the beginning of Charles's personal rule, a period during which he refused to summon Parliament at all. For 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, England would be governed entirely by royal decree. Supporters of the king called it a time of stability. Critics called it tyranny. Whatever the label, one thing was clear: the old partnership between king and Parliament had been shattered. During this period, the political landscape changed dramatically. Without Parliament as a check on his authority, Charles implemented policies more freely than ever. He expanded ship money. He increased the power of church courts. He elevated advisors who supported centralized royal control. In the absence of open debate, opposition was driven underground, but it didn't disappear. It grew quieter, more bitter, more determined. Meanwhile, the people remembered. The events of 1629, the speaker held in his chair, the shouted resolutions, the imprisonment of MPs became legend. They were whispered in taverns, recalled in churches, and printed in underground pamphlets. A sense of grievance spread. And with it came a growing question: if Parliament could be dissolved so easily, what recourse did the people have? At the heart of the conflict was the principle of consent. Parliament saw itself as the voice of the realm. Without it, no law was legitimate, no tax was fair, no rule was secure. But Charles believed that kings were chosen by God, not by votes or voices. In his mind, Parliament existed to support the crown, not to limit it. And as long as he sat on the throne, he would not share power with those he viewed as mutinous subjects. This fundamental disagreement over who had the right to govern could not be bridged with compromise. Each side believed the other was breaking centuries of English tradition. Each saw themselves as defending the nation's true soul. And both believed that history would vindicate their cause. By 1630, the wounds had not healed. They had deepened. Parliament was gone, but its champions had not vanished. Men like Pym Hampton and Holles waited, watched, and planned. They wrote letters. They built alliances. They spread their message through sermons and pamphlets. They knew that eventually the king would need Parliament again, and when he did, they would be ready. That moment would come sooner than expected. Events in Scotland, a realm that Charles ruled but barely understood, would soon spiral out of control. A religious rebellion there would force the king to raise funds for war. And to raise funds, he would have to do the one thing he had refused for over a decade: call Parliament. When that day came, the members would return not as supplicants, but as adversaries. They would come with demands, with grievances, and with resolve. And the memory of that last confrontation in 1629 would still hang in the air, a reminder of how easily power could be seized or lost. The dissolution of Parliament had bought Charles time, but it had cost him the trust of his people, the loyalty of many nobles, and the last fragile bond between crown and commons. When the body returned, it would not return to advise, it would return to challenge. And the road to civil war would be set in motion. After the dramatic dissolution of Parliament in 1629, King Charles I stood alone at the helm of England. For the next 11 years, he would govern without any parliamentary input, guidance, or resistance. This era became known as the personal rule. and while some called it a time of peace, others would forever remember it as a quiet tyranny, an uneasy calm before a national storm. To Charles, ruling without Parliament was not a temporary emergency, it was a return to the ideal order. He had long believed that kings were appointed by God and did not require the consent of assemblies to govern. Parliament, in his eyes, had overstepped. Their defiance in 1629, their resistance to his taxes, and their attempts to limit his religious authority had made them a threat to harmony and royal dignity. With them gone, Charles believed he could finally restore balance, and for a time it seemed to work. England was not at war. Trade resumed. The streets were calm. Without parliamentary debates, there were no public political clashes. To observers at a distance, the kingdom looked settled. But beneath that appearance, tension quietly swelled. The machinery of government was running, but not with the voices of the people. It was powered by royal decree, loyal advisors, and a firm belief that order could only come from above. Charles surrounded himself with men who shared his vision. Chief among them was William Laud, whom the king appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. Laud was a champion of religious uniformity ceremony and the power of bishops. Under his influence, churches across England underwent quiet transformations. Altars were raised, prayer books standardized, and ministers urged to enforce conformity. For moderate Anglicans, these changes may have seemed like refinements. But for Puritans who valued simplicity, direct worship, and freedom from hierarchy, it was a declaration of war. Laud's reforms were enforced harshly. Ministers who resisted were removed from their pulpits. Those who published opposing views were censored, fined, or imprisoned. Some were even mutilated, having ears cut off or cheeks branded with hot irons. The courts of High Commission and Star Chamber became tools of intimidation. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. Outside of religion, Charles continued to raise funds without Parliament. He expanded his use of ship money, forcing inland counties to pay taxes traditionally reserved for coastal defense. He granted monopolies over trade goods, driving up prices and frustrating merchants. He resurrected ancient laws to fine those who ignored knighthood summons or built homes in undesignated areas. These financial tactics kept the crown afloat, but they stirred resentment from every corner of society. And yet Charles believed he was doing what was right. To him, peace was proof of success. No open rebellions, no foreign invasions, no parliamentary quarrels. His court life thrived during this time. The arts flourished. Charles was a patron of painting, music, and theater. Masks and pageants dazzled at court. The Queen Henrietta Maria gave birth to children securing the royal line. To those inside Whitehall Palace, it was a golden time. But outside the palace walls, cracks widened. The Puritan underground grew. Secret sermons were held. Smuggled pamphlets attacked the Church of England. Discontented nobles and gentry met in quiet circles speaking of law, liberty, and the dangers of unchecked power. Even moderate landowners began to wonder if the king could rule alone forever, what role was left for them. What made this period especially dangerous was that opposition had no legal outlet. With Parliament dissolved, critics had no platform to voice their concerns, no vote to delay new laws, no committee to investigate injustice. Resistance had to move elsewhere, to pulpits, to printed tracts, or eventually to the streets. Ironically, the quiet of the personal rule made it hard to see the coming storm. Many hoped that Charles would eventually recall Parliament and make peace. Some believed he had matured and that negotiation might still be possible. But these hopes would soon be dashed not by Englishmen, but by the Scots. In 1637, Charles made a fateful decision. Seeking religious unity across his kingdoms, he attempted to impose the English Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Church. Scotland, fiercely Presbyterian and proud of its independence, erupted in outrage. Riots broke out. Ministers defied royal orders. In Edinburgh, a woman famously hurled a stool at a bishop during a church service, an act that symbolized Scotland's rejection of royal overreach. This defiance escalated. In 1638, Scottish nobles and clergy signed the National Covenant pledging to resist religious interference. They were not rebelling against the crown yet, but they were drawing a clear line. Their church was not England's to mold. In response, Charles raised an army. But without Parliament, his funds were limited. The bishops' wars, as they became known, revealed the weakness of his position. His forces were poorly supplied, underpaid, and hesitant to fight. When the Scottish army invaded northern England in 1640 and occupied key towns, Charles had no choice. To raise a proper army, he needed money. To get money, he needed Parliament. And so, after 11 years of silence, he called them back. The personal rule was over, but its legacy would haunt what came next. Years of unchallenged royal decisions, harsh religious policies, and creative taxation had alienated every corner of the realm. When Parliament returned, it did not come as a humbled body ready to assist. It came roaring back with vengeance. Many MPs had kept careful record of the past decade. They wanted answers. They wanted justice, and some wanted retribution. The king's long experiment in autocracy had not brought stability. It had simply delayed a deeper reckoning. A reckoning that would soon unfold in the form of rebellion, resistance, and civil war. For 11 years, Charles had ruled alone, but he would not rule alone again. While King Charles ruled without Parliament, one man rose to prominence as the architect of the king's religious vision, William Laud. Appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633, Laud became the king's most trusted advisor in matters of faith. And under his guidance, the Church of England would begin a transformation that sparked anger, fear, and eventually rebellion across the kingdom. Laud believed the church had become too disordered. He wanted structure, beauty, and reverence restored to English worship. That meant altars returned to the east end of churches, rails placed around them, stained glass repaired, and ceremonies made more uniform. He emphasized hierarchy, tradition, and the authority of bishops. His reforms were not random. They were rooted in his theology known as Arminianism, which rejected the harsh predestination taught by the Calvinist wing of the Protestant world. To many Anglicans, Laud's reforms felt familiar and even welcome. They brought a sense of majesty back into religious life. Services became more ceremonial, more orderly, and in Laud's view, more fitting for the worship of God. But to Puritans, the changes were nothing short of a betrayal. They saw them not as reverent, but as dangerous steps toward Rome. The English Puritans had long believed the Church of England was too Catholic in practice. For decades, they had called for further reform, simpler services, plain clothing for ministers, and the elimination of rituals they saw as superstitious. They wanted a pure church, one governed not by bishops and crowns, but by scripture and congregations. Under Laud's leadership, all of that seemed to be slipping away. What angered them most was not just what Laud changed, but how he changed it. His reforms were enforced from the top down, with little room for local tradition or dissent. Ministers who refused to follow the new instructions were dismissed. Parishioners who protested were summoned before church courts. In some cases, punishments were severe and public designed to make examples of those who resisted. One of the most infamous cases involved three Puritan writers, John Bastwick, Henry Burton, and William Prynne. They had published pamphlets criticizing Laud and the bishops. In response, they were tried by the Star Chamber Court, a powerful and secretive body that acted outside the normal legal system. The punishment was brutal. The men had their ears cut off and their cheeks branded with the letters SL for seditious libeler. One of them, Prynne, had already been punished in the same way years earlier. Now he was scarred twice over a living symbol of the regime's cruelty. To Laud and Charles, such punishments were necessary. They believed religious unity was the foundation of social order. To tolerate dissent in their view was to invite chaos, but the Puritan public saw things very differently. These punishments did not silence critics, they created martyrs. Stories of the three men spread far and wide. Their images were printed in pamphlets. Their writings were smuggled into homes and read aloud in secret gatherings. What Laud intended as discipline became inspiration. Meanwhile, other signs of Catholic influence stirred anxiety. Laud insisted that church music be restored. Clergy were instructed to wear elaborate vestments. Crosses reappeared in churches. In some places, even images of saints were quietly reintroduced. None of these things were illegal, but to Puritans they were evidence of a slippery slope. They feared that Laud, with the king's support, was leading England back to the old faith. Laud also insisted on strict control over preaching. He issued licenses deciding who could and could not speak from the pulpit. Unauthorized sermons were banned. Even private meetings for prayer or discussion known as conventicles were investigated. This directly targeted the Puritan practice of organizing small, scripture-focused gatherings outside the official church. In many towns, tension rose. People argued over where to place altars. Congregations split over vestments. Some families refused to enter their local church, choosing to worship in secret or travel miles to find a safe minister. In Puritan strongholds like East Anglia, entire communities became defiant, standing together against Laud's orders. But they had few options. With Parliament dissolved, there was no place to appeal for protection. The only voices that mattered were the king's and Laud's, and they spoke with one will. Outside England, things were even worse. When Laud and Charles tried to impose their religious vision on Scotland, the result was immediate and explosive. The Scottish Church, fiercely Presbyterian, rejected bishops altogether. They believed in a flat hierarchy and local control. So when the English prayer book was introduced in 1637, riots broke out across the lowlands. Churches were stormed, ministers attacked, and worship disrupted. One riot famously began when a stool was thrown at a bishop in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. This defiance spread rapidly. In 1638, Scottish nobles and clergy signed the National Covenant a solemn oath to defend their church and resist all foreign interference. This was not just a protest, it was the beginning of organized resistance, and it placed England on a collision course with war. Back in England, the unrest did not go unnoticed. Puritans cheered the Scots for standing up to Laud. Many hoped that Scotland's rebellion would inspire change at home. Underground networks began printing and distributing Scottish sermons, speeches, and calls to action. The idea that bishops were enemies of true religion gained strength. The divide between crown and country widened. And in the middle of it all, Laud stood unbending. He refused to compromise. He dismissed all criticism as rebellion against church order and divine will. Charles backed him fully. Together they marched forward with their vision of a uniform, ceremonial, top-down Church of England. But they failed to see how much resistance they were creating, not just among radical Puritans, but among ordinary Protestants who simply wanted peace, fairness, and freedom of conscience. By the time Charles was forced to recall Parliament in 1640, the anger toward Laud was immense. MPs returned with long memories and a thirst for accountability. One of their first acts was to demand Laud's arrest. He would be placed in the Tower of London, charged with high treason, and eventually executed. But long before his trial, his work had already shaped the nation. His reforms, his punishments, and his refusal to yield helped transform a generation of quiet believers into determined activists. They turned grievance into movement, and movement into revolution. Archbishop Laud did not start the war, but he helped lay the groundwork for it brick by brick, altar by altar, law by law. While tensions simmered in England under the rule of Charles I and Archbishop Laud, the first open flames of rebellion began to blaze not in Westminster, but far to the north in Scotland. There the people were fiercely protective of their Presbyterian church, a faith built on simplicity, local control, and the absence of bishops. For generations, they had worshipped in a manner distinct from their English neighbors. But in 1637, Charles and Laud tried to change that. Their attempt to impose Anglican-style worship on the Scottish Church would not only fail, it would ignite a chain of events that plunged the British Isles into open warfare. The spark came with a book. Specifically, the new Book of Common Prayer, crafted under Laud's supervision, was sent north with orders to replace traditional Scottish liturgy. It was filled with ceremonial language, set prayers, and formal structure, all closely tied to the English Church. For the Scots, this was not just unwelcome, it was offensive. They saw it as an invasion of their spiritual independence, an English crown attempting to dictate the manner of their worship. The reaction was immediate, passionate, and defiant. On July 23, 1637, the new prayer book was read for the first time in St. Giles Cathedral, Edinburgh. As the minister began reciting from it, a market woman named Jenny Geddes famously stood up and hurled a wooden stool at the preacher's head. "Dost thou say Mass at my lug?" she shouted, accusing him of speaking Catholic blasphemy in her ear. Chaos erupted. Others joined the protest. The service broke down into a violent scuffle, and though the stool may have missed its mark, its symbolic force was undeniable. That moment became legend. Jenny Geddes' stool would later be carved into pamphlets, stories, and paintings. But more importantly, her act of defiance tapped into a widespread and growing fury. Protests flared up across Edinburgh and quickly spread to other cities. Mobs disrupted services. Ministers were harassed. Copies of the prayer book were publicly burned. From nobles to servants, a sense of national insult took hold. The English king had tried to change their religion, and Scotland would not allow it. In response to this surge of outrage, Scottish leaders acted with stunning speed and unity. In early 1638, nobles, ministers, and laypeople drafted and signed the National Covenant, a solemn oath to uphold the traditional practices of the Scottish Kirk and resist any attempt to impose changes by royal authority. It pledged loyalty to the king, but only on the condition that the Church's independence be preserved. Tens of thousands of Scots signed the document. It was read aloud in churches. Copies were distributed by hand across the Highlands and Lowlands. In just weeks, the National Covenant had become a nationwide movement, peaceful in tone, but firm in resolve. It declared that Scotland's faith was not for sale, not for negotiation, and certainly not for forced revision from London. Charles was stunned by the scale and speed of this resistance. At first, he dismissed it as a temporary protest. Then he blamed a handful of radical ministers. But as support for the covenant grew, he began to understand the seriousness of the threat. And yet, true to form, he refused to compromise. Instead, he chose confrontation. In 1639, Charles raised an army and prepared to march north, but he faced an immediate problem: money. England's finances were already stretched thin by years of unpopular taxation, and Charles, having ruled without Parliament for a decade, had no reliable means of raising new funds quickly. His army was poorly equipped and undertrained. Meanwhile, the Scots, motivated, organized, and defending their homeland, mobilized with remarkable efficiency. The resulting clash became known as the First Bishops' War. In truth, it was more a standoff than a full-scale battle. The English army advanced to the border but hesitated. The Scots took defensive positions but avoided direct combat. After a few minor skirmishes and much negotiation, both sides agreed to the pacification of Berwick in June 1639, a temporary truce that solved nothing. Far from being resolved, the core issues remained untouched. The Scots refused to abandon the covenant. Charles refused to abandon the prayer book. Each side accused the other of violating the truce. And behind the scenes, both began preparing for the next phase of war. The following year, 1640, saw the outbreak of the Second Bishops' War. This time, the Scots took the offensive. Led by the capable General Alexander Leslie, their army crossed into northern England. They moved quickly and decisively, defeating English forces at the Battle of Newburn and capturing Newcastle, England's vital coal port. The loss was humiliating for Charles. Even worse, he was now forced to pay the Scottish army to remain where they were, essentially funding their occupation of English territory. Desperate and cornered, Charles was finally forced to do what he had avoided for 11 years: recall Parliament. On April 13, 1640, the short Parliament convened, but Charles, still clinging to his authority, dissolved it after just 3 weeks, when MPs refused to grant him funds without first addressing political grievances. A few months later, with no money and Scottish troops still occupying the north, he summoned what would become known as the Long Parliament in November 1640. This time, Parliament would not be dismissed so easily. The bishops' wars were over, but the damage was done. Charles had attempted to enforce religious uniformity, but he had only united the Scots against him. He had tried to assert royal control, but had been forced to bend. And most importantly, he had revealed his vulnerability. Parliament had seen it. The people had seen it. The myth of an all-powerful king had cracked. Scotland had defied the crown and won. And their resistance, born from religious conviction and national pride, would soon inspire others across the British Isles. The flame that had been lit in St. Giles Cathedral was spreading, and England, still simmering with its own grievances, was about to explode. In the autumn of 1640, King Charles I found himself in a position no English monarch envied, desperate, cornered, and humiliated. His efforts to impose religious reforms on Scotland had backfired spectacularly. Instead of securing obedience, he had ignited national resistance, suffered military defeat, and now faced an occupying army on English soil. Worse yet, the enemy's wages, £850 a day, were being paid out of his empty treasury. There was no more money, no more time, and no more illusions of absolute control. For 11 years, Charles had ruled without Parliament, believing he could govern through prerogative alone. During that time, he had found creative, often questionable ways to finance his government. Ship money, forced loans, fines based on forgotten medieval laws. But those sources had dried up. Merchants refused to pay. Landowners dragged their feet. Even his most loyal courtiers began to question the wisdom of continuing down a path that clearly led nowhere. The king had run out of options. To raise an army large enough to confront the Scots, he needed gold, and lots of it. That meant recalling the one body he had worked so hard to avoid Parliament. On April 13, 1640, he summoned a new Parliament, hoping it would be brief, cooperative, and generous. He offered no apology for his previous actions. Instead, he asked for immediate funds to crush the Scottish uprising. But the members who returned to Westminster had no intention of writing a blank check. They came with memories of the past decade, with grievances that had piled up like storm clouds, and with a clear demand: reform first, funding later. This assembly became known as the Short Parliament. It lasted just 3 weeks. Rather than debate military budgets, MPs demanded answers. Why had the king raised taxes without consent? Why had dissenters been mutilated in the public square? Why had religious policy been allowed to drift toward Catholicism under Archbishop Laud? Every question was a challenge to Charles's authority. Every demand felt to him like insubordination. Charles, never one to tolerate dissent lightly, quickly lost patience. On May 5, 1640, he dissolved the Short Parliament. The members went home frustrated, but not surprised. The king, meanwhile, found himself no closer to his goal. The Scots remained in control of Newcastle. His soldiers were unpaid and poorly supplied. His reputation had taken yet another blow, and then came the final blow. In August of that year, the Scots launched a bold and unexpected offensive. Led by the seasoned General Alexander Leslie, their army crossed the River Tweed and swept south into northern England. On August 28th, they met and defeated the king's forces at the Battle of Newburn, just outside Newcastle. The victory was quick, decisive, and humiliating. Charles's army fell apart. Newcastle, the vital coal port that heated London's homes, fell into Scottish hands. Now Charles not only lacked money, he lacked territory, and the cost of peace was staggering. Under the Treaty of Ripon, signed in October 1640, He was required to pay the Scottish army's expenses while they remained in England. The daily price, £850 a sum, the royal treasury simply could not provide. There was no longer any avoiding it. If Charles wanted to keep his throne, he needed money. If he needed money, he needed Parliament. And this time he would have to let them speak. On November 3, 1640, Charles summoned what would become known as the Long Parliament. Unlike the Short Parliament earlier that year, this body would not be easily dismissed. In fact, it would sit in various forms for the next 20 years. Its members arrived determined, battle-hardened by years of frustration and ready to act. They came not just to grant or deny funds, but to change how England was governed. One of their first acts was to go after the king's closest advisors, the Earl of Strafford. Charles's most trusted military strategist and political lieutenant was arrested on charges of treason. So too was Archbishop Laud, the man who had shaped religious policy for over a decade. Both men were symbols of Charles's rule during the personal rule period, and now both were being made to answer for it. Strafford's trial gripped the country. Parliament used it as a stage to air every grievance of the past decade. In 1641, after weeks of intense debate and public pressure, Strafford was executed. Laud remained in prison, awaiting his fate. It was a warning to the king Parliament would no longer be silent. Charles had hoped to use Parliament to raise funds. Instead, he had revived a political force that was angry, organized, and unafraid. And as the months passed, the Long Parliament passed more legislation to limit royal power. It abolished the king's hated Star Chamber Court, curtailed arbitrary taxation, and declared that Parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent. This last law was particularly striking. It meant that Charles could never again do what he had done in 1629 or 1640, shut Parliament down when it became inconvenient. Now they were anchored in place. The king had to listen. He had no choice. But as Parliament grew stronger, Charles grew more defensive. He still believed in divine right. He still saw compromise as weakness. And with every new demand from MPs, he saw a personal insult, a threat to his God-given authority. He smiled in meetings but plotted in private. He sought allies abroad. He considered raising his own forces. The very idea that he must beg for funds and tolerate criticism from commoners offended his every instinct. Tensions rose. Trust eroded. Then, in 1641, Charles made a decision that shattered what little hope remained for peace. He entered the House of Commons with armed guards, intending to arrest 5 MPs he believed were conspiring against him. But the men had already fled. The chamber sat in shocked silence. Charles looked around, his voice tense, and asked, "I see the birds are flown." It was a moment that echoed across England. For the first time in memory, a king had violated the sacred space of Parliament with armed men. From that moment on, the road to civil war lay wide open. While England was locked in a bitter political struggle and Scotland stood defiantly occupied in the north, a third crisis erupted, this time in Ireland. The Irish Rebellion of 1641 did more than shake the already fragile foundation of Charles I's authority. It struck fear into the hearts of English Protestants, fueled a wave of anti-Catholic hysteria, and pushed the tense relationship between king and Parliament to the breaking point. What had begun as a constitutional battle was quickly becoming a conflict soaked in blood suspicion and sectarian violence. The roots of rebellion in Ireland were deep. For centuries, the island had been a contested territory. English rulers had long sought to control it, using settlers, mostly Protestant planters from England and Scotland, to claim land and assert dominance over the native Irish population, which remained overwhelmingly Catholic. These colonists often received land confiscated from Irish nobles, creating bitter resentment. And while English officials claimed to bring order and civilization, most Irish saw the process as theft, humiliation, and cultural destruction. Under Charles's reign, tensions worsened. The policies of the Earl of Strafford. Charles's Lord Deputy in Ireland tightened English control but alienated nearly everyone. Irish Catholics resented his harsh rule. Protestant settlers feared his centralized power. Even the Old English Catholic landowners of English descent found themselves increasingly isolated. By the late 1630s, Ireland was a pressure cooker of religious tension, political marginalization, and economic exploitation. All it needed was a spark. That spark came in October 1641. A group of Irish Catholic nobles, believing that English authority was distracted by the crisis with Scotland, and Parliament launched a surprise rebellion. Their goal was to seize control of key strongholds and negotiate a better deal for Irish Catholics before England could respond. But what began as a coordinated political uprising quickly spiraled into chaos. As the rebellion spread, Irish peasants, many of them landless and long resentful, rose up with ferocity. Protestant settlers were attacked. Farms were burned. Entire communities were driven from their homes. In some areas, massacres took place. The number of Protestant deaths remains debated by historians, but the reports that arrived in England were horrifying and often exaggerated. Pamphlets poured into London, describing mutilations, torture, and the murder of women and children. Whether true or false, these stories stirred deep panic. To English Protestants, it seemed as though a Catholic uprising had begun, blessed by the Pope and aimed at exterminating the faithful. Many believed that Charles himself was behind it. It was in this atmosphere of fear and rage that Parliament and the King clashed again. Charles wanted to suppress the rebellion, and he knew he needed an army to do it. But Parliament was wary. Giving Charles control over an army, especially after his attempted arrest of MPs and his growing alliance with unpopular advisors, seemed incredibly dangerous. Some in Parliament believed that once he had an army, he might turn it against them instead of the rebels. The memory of his betrayal during the personal rule years was still fresh. On the other hand, Parliament could not ignore the slaughter in Ireland. Protestant communities were crying out for rescue. The pressure to act was immense. But who would control the army? Who would lead it? Who could be trusted? Some proposed that Parliament should raise its own army and direct it independently of the crown. But this challenged centuries of royal tradition. The king had always held command of military forces. Stripping that away would be unprecedented and a direct challenge to royal sovereignty. The debate became toxic. Charles demanded command. Parliament refused. Negotiations broke down. Neither side trusted the other, and the rebellion in Ireland continued unchecked. In villages and towns across England, the fear of Catholic plots spread. Many believed the Irish uprising was just the beginning of a wider conspiracy. Rumors swirled of Catholic armies landing on English shores. Some claimed that papists had already infiltrated the king's court. Others believed that the Queen Henrietta Maria, a Catholic, was secretly in league with the rebels. In this fevered atmosphere, political divides hardened. Moderates in Parliament, once willing to compromise, now began to shift toward the radicals. The idea that the king was part of a Catholic plot began to take root not just among Puritans, but among merchants, landowners, and even some nobility. Every delay in suppressing the rebellion was seen as evidence. Every silence from the throne was interpreted as guilt. Charles, for his part, was furious at the accusations. He issued proclamations condemning the violence. He denied any connection to the rebels. He called for swift justice. But his words rang hollow. His past deceptions, his alliances with unpopular figures, and his rigid belief in divine right made many doubt his sincerity. By early 1642, the Irish rebellion was still raging. Thousands were dead. Refugees poured into England, bringing with them stories of terror and bloodshed. Meanwhile, Parliament and the king were locked in a dangerous standoff. They could not agree on how to respond. They could not agree on who should lead. And as winter gave way to spring, England inched ever closer to civil war. The rebellion in Ireland had started as a separate crisis rooted in long-standing grievances between colonizer and colonized. But in the broader story of the English Civil War, it became something else entirely, a trigger, a symbol, and a mirror. It reflected England's own divisions, its own fears, and its own deep religious and political fractures. And as the violence across the Irish Sea continued, it became increasingly clear that the battle for England's future would no longer be fought with words alone. By early 1642, the fragile relationship between King Charles I and Parliament had all but collapsed. Years of mistrust, failed reforms, and political maneuvering had poisoned every avenue of negotiation. The rebellion in Ireland had deepened suspicions, and Parliament's growing demands for military control were now viewed by the king as outright rebellion. But what pushed the kingdom from political deadlock into the jaws of civil war was one reckless and unprecedented act: the king's attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament by force. Charles had grown increasingly paranoid. In his eyes, Parliament was no longer a partner. It was a cabal of enemies working to undermine the monarchy. Led by outspoken critics like John Pym, the House of Commons was making bold moves to limit royal authority. They had already impeached his closest advisors, passed acts that curtailed his powers, and insisted on control over the army to deal with the Irish uprising. Charles saw all of this as personal humiliation and political betrayal. Then came the straw that broke the royal patience, the Grand Remonstrance. Passed by the House of Commons in November 1641. This document outlined every grievance Parliament had against the king since the beginning of his reign. It was not only a legal and political indictment, it was an open appeal to the English people. Its publication enraged Charles. The idea that Parliament would air its grievances publicly without deference to the throne was, in his view, an act of sedition. Charles believed that radical members within Parliament, possibly backed by Puritan city leaders and even foreign agents, were plotting to overthrow him. Whether these conspiracies were real or imagined, he decided to act. His solution: a dramatic and unprecedented show of power, the personal arrest of 5 members of the House of Commons. On January 4th, 1642, Charles entered the chamber of the House of Commons, flanked by armed guards. He came looking for 5 men. John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollis, William Strode, and Sir Arthur Haselrig. These were his most vocal opponents, men he believed had gone too far in challenging the crown. His goal was to arrest them for treason, silence their voices, and reassert control over the government. But he had miscalculated. Word of the arrest plan had leaked. The 5 members were warned and had already fled the chamber. When Charles arrived, the house was full, but his targets were gone. What followed was one of the most tense and surreal moments in British political history. The king stood at the speaker's chair and demanded to know where the 5 were. The speaker, William Lenthal, knelt before the king and spoke words that echoed into history. "May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the house is pleased to direct me." It was a moment of defiance and a declaration of parliamentary independence. Realizing the failure of his plan, Charles muttered, "I see the birds are flown." Then he turned and left the chamber humiliated. The scene stunned the nation. No monarch had ever entered the Commons with armed men. No monarch had ever tried to arrest sitting members within the sacred walls of Parliament. It was seen as a violation not just of tradition, but of constitutional order itself. The public reaction was swift and fierce. London erupted in protest. Citizens took to the streets, ringing bells, banging drums, and shouting slogans against the king. Armed militias began forming in the city. Crowds gathered outside the royal palace. Pamphlets condemned the attempted arrests as tyranny. The mood had shifted. If Charles had hoped to restore authority, he had instead united London against him. Fearing for his safety, Charles made a decision would alter the course of history. He fled the capital. On January 10th, 1642, the king and his family slipped out of London under cover of darkness and traveled north. His destination was Hampton Court, then Windsor, and eventually the royalist strongholds further afield. As he left, the crown's grip on the capital dissolved. Parliament remained in control. London's militias aligned with them. The printing presses churned out anti-royalist material. The court of the king, once the heart of English politics, was now in exile. Charles's departure sent a clear signal. The political struggle could no longer be contained by speeches or petitions. Trust had vanished. Each side began preparing for the worst. In towns across the country, gentry gathered men, raised money, and began to choose sides. Nobles aligned themselves with either Parliament or the king. Local militias drilled. Storehouses were stocked. A nation divided in thought was now dividing in arms. Meanwhile, Parliament moved to seize the initiative. They took control of London's military defenses, its navy, and much of its financial infrastructure. They issued ordinances to organize armed forces. Though technically unauthorized by royal command, Parliament's actions now carried the weight of national leadership. Their supporters saw them not as rebels, but as guardians of law and liberty. Charles, on the other hand, began building his own power base in the north. From York and later from Nottingham, he issued proclamations accusing Parliament of treason. He summoned loyal nobles and prepared to raise his own army. His call was clear: the crown was under attack. England must rally to defend its true king. But by leaving London, Charles had made a strategic mistake. He had surrendered the country's largest city, its financial heart, and its primary communications network. Parliament could now speak directly to the people without royal censorship. Their version of the crisis, one in which Charles had tried to violently seize power, became the dominant narrative. And so, within months of his failed arrest attempt, the fault lines were solidified. England was now a country with two governments, two armies, and two visions of legitimate rule. The king had raised his standard. Parliament had raised its regiments. Civil war was no longer a matter of if. It was now a matter of when. The moment Charles I fled London in January 1642, the nation entered a state of uncertainty unlike any in its recent memory. Power no longer flowed from a single source. Parliament now claimed authority in the capital, while the king gathered support in the countryside. Both sides issued proclamations, both claimed to be the true voice of England, and both began to raise armies. What had once been a struggle over policies and petitions now became a fight for control of the entire kingdom. England was splitting geographically, politically, socially. Lines were drawn not just between institutions, but within families, towns, and churches. Brothers found themselves on opposite sides. Fathers and sons chose different banners. The civil war that loomed ahead would not be fought between distant strangers. It would be deeply personal, cutting through the heart of English society. By the spring of 1642, Charles had moved to York, where he began consolidating royalist support among the northern nobility. Loyal earls and lords, still committed to the crown, arrived with soldiers, horses, and gold. In a bold move, the king ordered the raising of the royal standard, a ceremonial act that formally called his subjects to arms in defense of the monarchy. On August 22, 1642, at Nottingham Castle, Charles lifted the standard above a windy hill, though few onlookers were present. The moment was more symbolic than strategic, but it marked the official beginning of open war. Meanwhile, Parliament had not been idle. From London, it began organizing a national militia, issuing ordinances in the king's name despite his absence. They formed committees, raised loans, and negotiated support with sympathetic counties. Parliamentarian leaders such as John Pym and Oliver St. John emphasized that they were not rebels but patriots defending the Constitution. To them, Charles had broken the social contract, and Parliament had a duty to preserve England's legal and religious integrity. But ideology was not the only dividing force. Geography played a powerful role. Royalist support was strongest in the north and west, where loyalty to traditional authority ran deep. Parliamentarian strength lay in the south and east, particularly around London, the heart of commerce, printing, and political organization. The port cities and wealthy counties of the southeast, including Essex, Suffolk, and Kent, backed Parliament, giving them access to greater funds, more manpower, and superior infrastructure. Religion also fueled the divide. Puritans who wanted further reform of the church largely aligned with Parliament. They viewed Charles's religious policies under Archbishop Laud as dangerous and too Catholic. On the other hand, Anglicans who favored hierarchy bishops and formal liturgy tended to support the crown. For many, this wasn't just a war over governance. It was a battle for the soul of English Christianity. As armies formed, propaganda flourished. Pamphlets flooded the streets. Sermons stirred congregations. Each side painted the other as treacherous and ungodly. Royalists claimed Parliament sought to overthrow the monarchy and impose chaos. Parliamentarians argued the king had become a tyrant blind to the needs of his people and too easily manipulated by Catholic sympathizers. In practice, support was often based less on ideology and more on local conditions. Many landowners simply sided with the authority they believed would protect their estates. Others followed the lead of regional nobles or military commanders. Some communities tried to remain neutral, hoping the conflict would pass them by. But neutrality rarely lasted long. As troops moved, towns were forced to declare allegiances. Those who resisted were punished sometimes by both sides. Militarily, both sides began from a position of improvisation. England had no standing army. The forces raised were local militias trained only in basic combat, more accustomed to chasing poachers than marching in formation. Weapons were in short supply. Horses were requisitioned from farms. Officers were drawn from aristocrats and landowners who had never led men in battle. But as months passed, these militias would evolve into full-fledged armies. Charles established his military headquarters in Oxford, a royalist stronghold. The city's university culture and loyal gentry gave the king a base of operation, both symbolic and strategic. From here, he issued commands, planned campaigns, and received foreign envoys. Parliament, meanwhile, turned London into a fortress ringed with earthworks manned by volunteers and funded by taxes approved by a functioning, if divided, Parliament. The emotional toll of the split began to show quickly. Families faced agonizing decisions. Some sent sons to both sides. Churches were divided. Priests were torn between loyalty to the bishop and to their flock. Even neighbors began reporting one another to authorities, accusing rivals of sympathizing with traitors. The social fabric of England was being stretched to its limits. By the late summer of 1642, the two sides were ready. Skirmishes had already broken out in the countryside, raids on supply lines, clashes over arms caches, and local feuds inflamed by national loyalties. But the first full-scale battle was on the horizon. The two halves of England, like two storm fronts, were about to collide. The king had his army, Parliament had theirs, and the land between them would soon be soaked in blood. For those living through it, there was still a sense of disbelief. That England, a nation that had avoided civil war for centuries, was about to turn on itself seemed almost surreal. But the signs were undeniable. The king and Parliament had raised opposing armies. The kingdom was divided, and neither side would back down. There would be no more petitions, no more secret negotiations, no more legal maneuvering. From this point forward, England's future would be decided not by debate, but by the sword. As the summer of 1642 turned to autumn, the tension that had stretched across England for months finally snapped. Two armies now stood ready, each claiming to fight for the true order of the kingdom. One for the king, the other for Parliament. After months of preparations, proclamations, and minor skirmishes, the first full-scale battle of the English Civil War was about to begin. Its name would echo through history, Edge Hill. The Royalist army, led by King Charles I himself, had been marching south from Shrewsbury. His goal was clear: retake London. Reclaim the capital, and the heart of the realm would be back in royal hands. His men, numbering around 13,000, cavalry, local militia, and trained bands. Among them were the king's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, a skilled cavalry commander, and veteran officers from earlier continental wars. The parliamentarian forces under the command of the Earl of Essex were determined to stop him. Essex's army, similarly sized and composed, moved to intercept. On October 22, 1642, the two forces spotted each other near the village of Kyneton in Warwickshire. By dawn the next day, they were deployed across the wide slopes of Edgehill. The battlefield was eerily beautiful. Rolling countryside stretched in every direction. Mist hung low in the early morning. But as the fog lifted, two armies stood facing each other, bristling with muskets, pikes, and cannon. Flags fluttered, drums beat. For many of the men on both sides, this was their first real battle. They had trained for weeks, even months. But training is not war. Few understood what lay ahead. At midday on October 23rd, the signal was given. The royalist right wing, led by Prince Rupert and his cavalry, charged with terrifying speed. Parliament's left flank was overwhelmed. Rupert's horsemen smashed through the line, scattering soldiers and chasing the survivors deep into the countryside. It looked like a decisive victory for the king. But it was not. While Rupert pursued glory and loot, his forces became disorganized and distant. Back on the field, Parliament's center and right held firm. Under the disciplined command of Essex and his infantry officers, parliamentarian musketeers unleashed coordinated volleys. Royalist foot soldiers, less experienced in formation fighting, began to falter. The king's left wing attempted to mirror Rupert's success, but they met fierce resistance. Parliament's cavalry under Sir William Balfour held their ground and even pushed forward, cutting into the royalist center. For hours, the two sides exchanged musket fire, charged, retreated, and reformed in a chaotic and bloody dance. The smoke from gunpowder thickened. Commanders shouted themselves hoarse. Men fought hand-to-hand among hedgerows, over fences, and in open fields. By late afternoon, both armies were exhausted. The dead lay in heaps. Blood soaked the grass. Neither side could claim clear victory. Rupert's cavalry eventually returned, but too late to turn the tide. Essex had not been defeated, but neither had he won. As dusk fell, both sides pulled back to regroup. The next day they faced each other again, but neither side was willing to renew the full battle. The royalists retreated toward Oxford. The parliamentarians held the field, but failed to stop the king's overall advance. And so the Battle of Edgehill ended without a winner. But with thousands of dead and wounded, it made one thing clear: the war would be long, hard, and brutal. News of the battle spread quickly. Both sides claimed success. Royalist messengers declared that the king had proven his strength. Parliamentarian pamphlets praised Essex's resistance. But beyond the propaganda, a deeper truth settled across the country. This war would not be decided in a single clash. It would take many battles, many lives, and perhaps years to determine who would rule England. Edgehill was also a wake-up call for both armies. Training was inconsistent. Equipment was uneven. Coordination between infantry, cavalry, and artillery was poor. Discipline broke down easily under pressure. Commanders on both sides realized they had much to learn if they were to win future engagements. What had begun as a political struggle had become a military science. For the common soldiers, Edgehill was a horror. Many had signed up expecting honor, maybe adventure. Instead, they saw friends torn apart by cannon blasts, comrades scream in agony from musket wounds, and officers cut down mid-command. In muddy fields and quiet hedgerows, they bled and died for causes they barely understood. Yet despite the carnage, there was no turning back. Charles, though disappointed not to have seized a swift victory, returned to Oxford, which became his wartime capital. From there, he issued new orders, gathered more troops, and planned his next moves. Parliament, meanwhile, solidified its hold on London and began building a more professional army, one that would eventually become the new model army. Edgehill had changed everything. It was no longer a war of ideas, it was a war of arms. And after this first great test of strength, the question was no longer whether civil war had begun. The question was, who would survive it? After the bloody indecision at Edgehill, it became clear to all this war would not end quickly. There would be no single decisive battle to restore peace. Instead, England descended into a grinding, chaotic conflict, fought in fields, villages, forests, and cities across the realm. From 1642 to 1645, royalist and parliamentarian forces clashed again and again, each battle fueled by fresh anger, deeper resolve, and an ever-growing death toll. The months after Edgehill saw both sides scramble to secure strategic positions. Charles made Oxford his wartime capital, a central location with ancient fortifications and loyal academic support. Parliament held London the wealthiest and most populous city in the kingdom. But in the vast countryside, loyalties were mixed. Some counties leaned royalist, others parliamentarian. Many towns tried to remain neutral, but neutrality rarely lasted long. The war became a patchwork of sieges, skirmishes, and brutal raids. Small towns were captured and recaptured. Roads became dangerous, lined with patrols and ambushes. Trade collapsed in some regions, and food shortages became common. Local militias, once used for occasional defense, were now absorbed into larger armies, often forced to fight alongside strangers under unfamiliar command. One of the major early confrontations after Edgehill was the Battle of Turnham Green in November 1642. Charles had advanced toward London, hoping to strike at the political heart of Parliament. But when he reached the outskirts, he was met by a massive force, over 20,000 trained and armed Londoners. Faced with a city ready to defend itself, Charles hesitated and withdrew. It was a significant moment. Parliament had proven it could mobilize the capital's population, and London would remain under its control for the rest of the war. Over the next 2 years, the fighting spread in all directions. In the north, royalist forces under the Earl of Newcastle gained ground, especially in Yorkshire. They captured strongholds, secured coal supplies, and threatened Parliament's control of key northern cities. In the southwest, royalist cavalry launched deep raids into parliamentarian areas, capturing towns and harassing supply lines. Prince Rupert, the king's nephew, led many of these operations with flair and speed. His daring tactics made him famous, but also reckless at times. Parliament, in turn, began organizing its military efforts more systematically. Under the leadership of the Earl of Essex, Sir William Waller, and Sir Thomas Fairfax, parliamentarian armies pushed back in several regions. They recaptured towns, built defensive fortifications, and most critically, began implementing a more coordinated command structure. Still, internal rivalries among Parliament's commanders often hindered their effectiveness. The war was not only fought by regular troops, it was also a conflict of garrisons, sieges, and sudden attacks. Castles and fortified manor houses became battle sites. In some places, towns were bombarded for weeks until they surrendered. In others, surprise attacks broke through defenses in a single night. Civilians were often caught in the middle, robbed by soldiers from both sides, forced to house troops, or punished for harboring the enemy. Religious division added fuel to the fire. Royalist regions tended to protect Anglican clergy and traditional church structures. Parliamentarian areas, especially those influenced by Puritan thought, expelled bishops, banned the Book of Common Prayer, and appointed more radical preachers. In some towns, churches were stripped of ornaments, crosses were smashed, and altars torn down. In others, royalist troops restored traditional worship, sometimes violently. For many ordinary people, faith was no longer a source of comfort. It had become another front in the war. Economically, the war was devastating. Farms were looted. Trade routes collapsed. Entire communities fled their homes. In areas of constant conflict, people lived in fear not just of enemy troops, but of starvation, plague, and lawlessness. Taxes soared on both sides as armies demanded money, horses, food, and equipment. Inflation ruined small landowners. Even the wealthy began to feel the pinch. No one was safe from war's slow devastation. But amidst the chaos, new leaders began to emerge. One such figure was Oliver Cromwell, a relatively unknown member of Parliament from Huntingdon. He raised a small cavalry unit early in the war and quickly gained a reputation for discipline and effectiveness. Unlike many noble officers, Cromwell promoted men based on ability rather than birth. His Ironsides, as they came to be known, were fierce, well-trained, and deeply committed to both Parliament and Puritan ideals. As Parliament's military strategy evolved, Cromwell's influence grew. He pushed for greater professionalism, clearer command structures, and a national army that could stand against the Royalists on equal footing. His vision and the failures of Parliament's early campaigns laid the groundwork for a major transformation, the creation of the new model army. But that would come later. In the years between 1642 and 1645, England was consumed by chaos. Battles like Marston Moor in 1644 would prove turning points. But until then, the country remained torn in every direction. Men were conscripted and sent to distant fields. Families grieved without answers. Nobles sold estates to pay for regiments. Churches stood silent or were defiled. And through it all, Parliament and the king continued to claim they alone had the people's trust. There were no clean fronts. The war twisted through hills, forests, villages, and cities. It crept into homes, divided communities, and left a trail of ashes and sorrow. And yet the nation endured. Towns rebuilt, armies reorganized, leaders adapted, and both sides pressed on convinced they were fighting for the soul of England. But as the war dragged into its third year, it became clear that a decisive shift was needed. Parliament's forces were strong but fragmented. The king still held influence but faced dwindling support. The people were tired. The land was scarred. Something had to change. A new strategy, a new army, a new leader. That change was coming, and with it the war would enter its next and most transformative phase. By the end of 1643, the war had dragged on for over a year longer than many had expected. Both royalist and parliamentarian armies had tasted victory and defeat, yet neither side had landed a knockout blow. But in the shadows of this prolonged conflict, a quiet transformation was underway, one that would alter the course of the war and of English history. At its center stood a man few had known when the fighting began, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell had not started the war as a general or nobleman. He was a minor landowner, a member of Parliament from Cambridgeshire, and a devout Puritan. When conflict erupted, he raised a small cavalry troop from local supporters, ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and townsmen. What made his force different wasn't their gear or numbers. It was their discipline, their purpose, their resolve. From the outset, Cromwell insisted on a new kind of soldier. He chose men not for their rank or social class, but for their character and commitment. He demanded sobriety, obedience, and religious conviction. His men did not drink or gamble in camp. They sang psalms before battle. They called one another brother. They were not perfect, but they believed they fought for something holy. And they followed Cromwell with near total trust. This cavalry unit, known as the Ironsides, quickly made an impact. At the Battle of Gainsborough in July 1643, Cromwell's men stood firm against royalist charges, then counterattacked with precision. Unlike many parliamentarian cavalry who lost discipline in pursuit, Cromwell's Ironsides returned to formation, ready to strike again. Time and again, they proved not only brave but reliable. Parliament's leadership took notice. At a time when its armies were struggling with poor coordination and inconsistent performance, Cromwell's unit stood out as a model. He was promoted steadily, first to colonel, then to lieutenant general of horse. As his authority grew, so did his influence. He began advocating for broader reform, not just of tactics, but of the entire structure of Parliament's war effort. Cromwell saw the core issue clearly. The war could not be won with divided command rivalries among nobles or half-hearted soldiers. What Parliament needed was a centralized professional army, one that could fight not just defensively, but decisively. In 1644, his vision began to gain traction. That summer, Parliament scored a major victory at the Battle of Marston Moor, in part due to Cromwell's cavalry, which helped turn the tide. It was the largest battle of the war to date and marked the collapse of royalist power in the north. Cromwell, though wounded in the fighting, was hailed as a hero, but Parliament's overall war strategy was still hampered by internal divisions. Many commanders were also sitting members of Parliament, balancing politics with military leadership. These dual responsibilities often caused delays, conflicts of interest, and hesitancy in the field. Cromwell believed this was unacceptable. He wanted a military command based on ability, not privilege. His push for reform led to the Self-Denying Ordinance in 1645. Under this act, all members of Parliament were required to resign their military commands. This cleared the way for a fresh start. And that fresh start came in the form of a bold new organization, the New Model Army. The New Model Army was unlike anything England had seen. It was centrally funded, professionally trained, and deeply ideological. Soldiers were paid regularly, given uniforms, and drilled with consistency. Officers were promoted by merit, not family name. and many of its ranks shared a common religious vision rooted in Puritan ideals of justice, equality under God, and moral discipline. Cromwell did not immediately lead the new model army, but his fingerprints were on every aspect of its formation. Sir Thomas Fairfax was appointed commander-in-chief, a respected leader, and a unifying figure. Cromwell, retained as Lieutenant General of Horse by special exemption, commanded the cavalry. Their first major test came at the Battle of Naseby in June 1645. It was a turning point. The Royalist army, personally led by Charles I, met the new model army in open battle. At first, it seemed the Royalists might prevail. Prince Rupert's cavalry again smashed through Parliament's left wing. But Cromwell's horsemen on the right were different. They did not chase glory. They did not pursue fleeing enemies. Instead, they wheeled back into the center of the field and hit the king's infantry with devastating force. The result was a total rout. Charles's army was destroyed. His baggage train was captured, including personal letters that revealed secret negotiations with foreign Catholic powers. These letters were published by Parliament and used to undermine the king's support even further. After Naseby, the Royalists would never fully recover. One by one, their strongholds fell. Parliament's momentum grew, and Cromwell's influence within the army and the country deepened. What made Cromwell so effective was not just his skill in battle. It was his clarity of purpose. He believed the war was not only about who should govern England, but how England should be governed. He saw Parliament not simply as a political body, but as the protector of godly rule. And he viewed the king's intransigence not as stubbornness, but as defiance against divine justice. To his enemies, he was a dangerous fanatic. To his soldiers, he was a father figure. To history, he would become one of the most complex leaders of his age. The rise of Cromwell changed Parliament's military fortunes, but it also changed the character of the war. No longer was this just a conflict between Crown and Commons. It was becoming a struggle over the very soul of England, its governance, its religion, and its future. And as Cromwell's power grew, so too did the question that would soon dominate every conversation in Westminster and beyond. What would happen when the king was finally defeated? After the decisive victory at Naseby in 1645, the tide of war turned definitively in Parliament's favor. The king's once formidable army lay shattered, his reputation damaged by the public release of his secret correspondence and his alliances fraying at the edges. In contrast, the new model army, driven by disciplined faith and ruthless efficiency, was only just beginning to show its full power. Under the leadership of Sir Thomas Fairfax and the indomitable Oliver Cromwell, this revolutionary force swept across England, with purpose crushing royalist strongholds, one after another. What set the new model army apart was not just its organization, it was its morale. These were not mercenaries or conscripted villagers with little stake in the conflict. They were men who believed in the cause, many of them deeply religious, convinced that they were fighting not just for Parliament, but for a godlier, freer England. Cromwell inspired them not with grandeur or promises of spoils, but with purpose. His soldiers saw themselves as instruments of divine justice. The army's structure reflected its ideals. Officers were selected by ability, not by aristocratic birth. Orders were followed swiftly. Units were trained to fight as cohesive teams. Even the wounded and sick were better cared for than in most armies of the time. Parliament had invested in a force that wasn't just effective, it was sustainable. After Naseby, the new model army moved quickly to capitalize on its momentum. First, they turned westward toward the remaining royalist centers of resistance. One by one, they laid siege to key cities, Bristol, Bath, Exeter. These were not just military targets, but symbolic ones. As Cromwell and Fairfax advanced, they sent out proclamations inviting towns to surrender peacefully. Many did. The people had grown weary of war taxes and the destruction that followed every army. For some, the parliamentarians seemed to offer stability and order, especially when compared to the now desperate royalist leadership. But when resistance was met, the response was swift and brutal. The siege of Basing House in Hampshire was a grim example. The grand estate had been held by royalist forces for over 2 years, withstanding multiple attacks. In October 1645, Cromwell led the final assault. After a fierce bombardment, his troops stormed the walls. The defenders were cut down. The house was looted and burned. It was a clear message royalist defiance would no longer be tolerated. The new model army then turned its attention to the southwest, an area where royalist loyalty remained stubborn. Towns like Barnstaple, Tiverton, and Dartmouth fell in rapid succession. In each case, the army showed a pattern: overwhelming force, limited mercy for continued resistance, and often surprisingly fair treatment for those who surrendered early. It was war, but with rules. A sense of mission, not vengeance. In early 1646, the final royalist strongholds in the north began to collapse. The fortress city of Chester surrendered. Newark followed. Oxford, the king's wartime capital, was surrounded and isolated. Inside Charles's court was shrinking. Supplies were running low. Morale was crumbling. Faced with total defeat, the king made a fateful decision. On May 5, 1646, disguised and traveling in secret, Charles surrendered not to Parliament, but to the Scottish army camped in the north. He hoped to use Scotland as a bargaining tool to negotiate a settlement that might allow him to retain power under new terms. But this act only deepened the divisions among his enemies. The Scots, who had fought alongside Parliament, but with their own goals, now became Charles's reluctant custodians. With the king captured and the royalist armies broken, the First English Civil War came to a close. But peace remained elusive. While royalist resistance had been crushed militarily, the question of what to do with the king divided Parliament, the Scots, and even the new model army itself. Some wanted Charles restored under strict constitutional limits. Others believed he could no longer be trusted. A few, particularly among the army's more radical officers and soldiers, began to whisper a dangerous idea that the king should be held accountable for what had happened, that he should be put on trial. But for the moment, the military task was complete. Cromwell and Fairfax returned to London, not as rebels, but as national figures. The new model army was hailed by many as the savior of Parliament's cause. Yet with that admiration came fear. A standing army bound by ideology and loyal to its own commanders was a powerful force, too powerful, some believed. Tensions would soon rise between Parliament and the army. Political debates turned heated. New religious and social ideas began to take root among the troops, calls for expanded suffrage, freedom of conscience, even the end of monarchy. But those storms still lay on the horizon. What was clear in 1646 was this: Cromwell's new model army had succeeded where all others had failed. It had taken a kingdom divided and delivered military victory to Parliament. The war, once unpredictable and scattered, had ended in methodical, relentless conquest. But victory in battle was not the same as peace. The king was still alive. Parliament was still divided. The army, though victorious, was restless. The sword had settled the question of power for now. But the question of how England should be governed still remained. And for Oliver Cromwell, that question had only just begun. By 1646, the war appeared to be over. The royalist armies had been dismantled, Charles I had surrendered, and the new model army stood triumphant. But peace did not come. Instead, England descended into a new kind of conflict, one not fought with muskets and swords, but with negotiations, plots, and ideological battles. At the heart of it all stood one lingering, dangerous question: what to do with the King Charles, now in Scottish custody, remained the focal point of power and fear. Though defeated, he had not changed. He believed deeply and unwaveringly that he was the anointed sovereign of England, accountable only to God. The war had not humbled him. It had confirmed in his view the dangers of yielding to rebellious subjects. And so instead of compromise, Charles turned to strategy. He played his enemies against each other. Parliament, the Scots, and the new model army had united to defeat him, but they had never agreed on what should happen next. The Scots wanted a Presbyterian church established across Britain. Parliament was divided between moderates seeking a constitutional monarchy and radicals pushing for deeper reform. And the army, deeply influenced by Puritan thought, wanted liberty of conscience and protections for religious minorities. Sensing opportunity, Charles entered secret negotiations with the Scots. In 1647, he signed a controversial agreement, the Engagement, in which he promised to establish Presbyterianism in England for 3 years in exchange for Scottish military support. It was a bold gamble. He hoped that a second war, this time with Scottish backing, might restore his crown. But it backfired. When news of the engagement broke, it sent shockwaves through England. Parliament felt betrayed. The army was outraged. They had spared the king, even protected him during imprisonment, and now he had plotted with foreign soldiers to reignite the war. The Second Civil War that followed in 1648 was shorter and less coordinated than the first, but it was brutal nonetheless. Royalist uprisings flared in Wales, Kent, and the north. A Scottish army invaded from the north. But the new model army, hardened and battle-tested, moved swiftly. Cromwell crushed uprisings across the countryside, culminating in a decisive victory against the Scots at the Battle of Preston. Within months, the Second War was over, and this time Parliament and the army agreed Charles could not be trusted. He had broken his promises. He had spilled more English blood. He had, in their eyes, betrayed the nation. A dramatic shift followed. The new model army, no longer content to act merely as Parliament's tool, took control. They purged Parliament of those who opposed trying the king, a move known as Pride's Purge. The remaining members, known as the Rump Parliament, moved forward with a plan that had once been unthinkable: to put the King of England on trial for treason. The legal and philosophical basis for such a move was radical. Kings were by tradition and belief above the law. But Parliament argued that Charles had violated the trust placed in him by the people. He had waged war against his own subjects. He had ignored laws, rejected reforms, and invited foreign armies onto English soil. Therefore, he must be held accountable. In January 1649, Charles I stood before a high court of justice, an unprecedented moment in European history. He refused to recognize the court's legitimacy. He refused to plead. He stood in silence or spoke only to defend the divine right of kings. But the court pressed on. Witnesses testified. Documents were presented. And after days of proceedings, the verdict was announced guilty. Charles I was sentenced to death. On January 30th, 1649, a cold and gray morning, the king was led from St. James's Palace to a scaffold erected outside the banqueting house at Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts, fearing the cold might make him shiver and be mistaken for fear. A hushed crowd gathered below. Soldiers lined the streets. Everyone knew they were witnessing something historic and dangerous. Charles faced the crowd and addressed them calmly. He spoke not in anger, but in dignity. He declared that he was the people's lawful king, and that he died a Christian according to the profession of the Church of England. He placed his head on the block and waited. At the signal, the executioner raised his axe and struck. The silence that followed was chilling. A groan rippled through the crowd. Some wept. Others stood in stunned silence. The executioner held up the king's head for all to see. The monarchy of England had been not just challenged, but decapitated. In the days that followed, the shock reverberated across Europe. Kings and queens sent letters of protest. Royalist supporters in England mourned deeply. But within Parliament and the army, there was a sense of solemn relief. The war, they believed, had finally ended. The threat of Charles's return was gone. Yet even in death, the king's shadow lingered. His execution had set a precedent never before seen that a monarch could be judged by his subjects and that the crown was not above the law. It raised new questions about governance, legitimacy, and power. Who ruled England now? What would replace the monarchy? Could a republic work in a nation long defined by royal lineage? The answers would come in the next chapter. But one thing was certain. The trial and execution of Charles I marked the most dramatic turning point in English history since the Norman Conquest. It was the end of an era, the collapse of a centuries-old belief that kings ruled by divine right. In its place stood a bold, uncertain idea that the people through Parliament and reason might rule themselves. With the execution of King Charles I in January 1649, England entered uncharted territory. For the first time in its history, it was no longer a monarchy. The crown had been cast down, and with it the very idea of hereditary kingship. What rose in its place was something entirely new, a republic declared in the name of the people and driven by the will of Parliament and the army. But in practice, power quickly coalesced around one man, Oliver Cromwell. Initially, the new government was known as the Commonwealth of England. It was meant to be a republic ruled by elected representatives and governed through laws rather than royal decree. The monarchy was abolished, as was the House of Lords. A Council of State was formed to act as the executive branch. The House of Commons, though now purged of many members, assumed full legislative authority. It was a bold experiment born in blood and revolution, but its foundations were fragile. England remained deeply divided. Royalist sympathies lingered in many counties. Ireland and Scotland outright rejected the regicide and declared Charles II, son of the executed king, as the rightful monarch. Abroad, foreign courts were appalled. Many European powers refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new English government. The threat of war invasion or civil unrest was constant. In this unstable climate, the army became the backbone of the state. And at the center of the army stood Cromwell. Though he did not immediately seize supreme power, Cromwell was the most respected and influential figure in the Commonwealth. A brilliant general, a committed Puritan, and a skilled political strategist, he wielded enormous authority both on the battlefield and in the halls of Westminster. His leadership would shape the Republic in ways few could have predicted. One of his first major acts was the brutal campaign in Ireland. In 1649, Cromwell led a military expedition to crush Irish resistance both from Catholic Confederates and Royalist allies. What followed was a series of sieges and massacres that left a dark stain on his legacy. At Drogheda and Wexford, thousands were killed, including civilians and prisoners. Cromwell believed he was carrying out divine justice against those who had supported rebellion and regicide. To his supporters, it was necessary. To his critics, it was ruthless. With Ireland subdued, Cromwell turned north. Scotland had crowned Charles II king and raised an army to restore the monarchy. In response, Cromwell marched into Scottish territory. In 1650, he met the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar and won a stunning victory. A year later at Worcester, he defeated Charles II's forces again. The young king fled to the continent, and the dream of royal restoration, for now, was over. Cromwell returned to England a hero, but also a man with a growing burden. The Commonwealth struggled to govern effectively. The Rump Parliament, the name given to the reduced group of MPs who had survived Pride's purge, was increasingly seen as corrupt, self-serving, and inefficient. They passed laws, slowly resisted reforms, and clung to power without calling new elections. The people, tired of war and upheaval, began to lose faith in the Republican experiment. In 1653, Cromwell took a drastic step. With the support of his army, he marched into Parliament and forcibly dissolved the Rump. According to legend, he shouted, "In the name of God, go," as soldiers cleared the chamber. Parliament, once the symbol of popular sovereignty, had become, at least in Cromwell's eyes, an obstacle to true godly governance. A new constitution was drafted, the instrument of government. It was the first written constitution in English history. Under it, Cromwell was named Lord Protector, a title that gave him near monarchical authority. Though technically still a servant of Parliament and the Council of State, Cromwell now ruled as the head of government and state. England, while still a republic in name, had taken on the shape of a military-backed dictatorship. Under Cromwell's rule, the nation experienced both order and oppression. He brought stability after years of war. He reformed the legal system. He promoted trade and began expanding English naval power abroad. He protected religious minorities, most notably allowing Jews to return to England after centuries of exile. He was seen by many as a strong, godly leader who had saved the nation from chaos. But his rule was also marked by deep repression. Cromwell's government enforced strict moral codes based on Puritan values. Theaters were closed. Christmas celebrations were discouraged. Swearing, drunkenness, and even sports on Sundays were punished. England, for a time, became a land of prayer meetings, plain clothing, and silent streets. Critics were censored, radicals imprisoned, and royalist plots ruthlessly crushed. Despite his power, Cromwell never took the crown. In the later years of his rule, he was offered kingship by Parliament and various supporters. The idea was to restore stability by returning to a monarchy, this time with Cromwell at the top. But he refused. Whether out of principle, political caution, or personal humility, he could not bring himself to wear the crown his army had destroyed. Cromwell ruled until his death in 1658. In that time, he transformed England. He ended the monarchy, defeated its heirs, and held the country together through sheer force of will. But he also left behind an unresolved dilemma. How could a republic survive without him? Because as soon as he was gone, the cracks in the new order began to widen. When Oliver Cromwell died on September 3, 1658, England stood at a crossroads. For nearly a decade, he had ruled as Lord Protector, part warrior, part statesman, and to some part, prophet. He had kept the republic together through force, faith, and sheer personal authority. But with his death, the question returned with full force: what kind of government could truly govern England? Cromwell had named his son Richard Cromwell as his successor. But Richard was not his father. He lacked military experience, political cunning, and the commanding presence that had allowed Oliver to lead a divided country. Within months of taking power, Richard struggled to assert control over Parliament, the army, and even his own supporters. The Republican experiment, already strained, began to unravel. The army, once the backbone of Cromwellian rule, soon turned on Richard. Senior officers resented his inexperience. They distrusted civilian leadership. Some wanted a return to a purer republic. Others hoped for personal advancement. Whatever their motives, they forced Richard to dissolve Parliament and resign as Lord Protector in 1659. With that, the brief Cromwellian dynasty came to an end. What followed was chaos. For the next year, England experienced political whiplash. Parliament was recalled, dissolved, reshaped, and recalled again. Military juntas rose and fell. Various factions, radical Republicans, conservative landowners, disillusioned soldiers, and royalist sympathizers vied for control. The army, which had once stood united behind Cromwell, fractured into rival cliques. In towns and villages, people whispered anxiously. Would there be another civil war? But amid the confusion, one figure quietly gathered support from across the spectrum: General George Monk. Monk had been a loyal Cromwellian commanding English forces in Scotland. But he was also a pragmatist, a man more concerned with stability than ideology. As England drifted into political paralysis, Monk saw only one path forward: the restoration of the monarchy. In early 1660, Monk marched south from Scotland with his army. His goal was clear but unspoken. He entered London without resistance. Unlike previous military takeovers, his arrival brought relief rather than fear. Parliament was once again restored, this time with the promise of free elections. Across the country, support for the monarchy surged. People had grown weary of puritanical rule, of political experiments, and of endless uncertainty. Sensing the changing mood, Parliament invited Charles II, son of the executed king, to return to England as monarch, under the condition that he govern according to the law and respect the liberties of his subjects. Charles, who had been living in exile in France and the Netherlands, accepted with caution and gratitude. In May 1660, Charles II landed at Dover to cheers, bells, and bonfires. The streets were packed with crowds. Church bells rang for days. Royal banners flew once more over city halls and cathedrals. After 11 years of Republican rule, the monarchy had been restored not by bloodshed, but by overwhelming public support. Thus began what is now known as the Restoration. Charles II was wise enough to understand the fragility of his throne. He issued the Declaration of Breda, promising general amnesty, religious toleration, and respect for Parliament. Though many had feared revenge, Charles adopted a tone of reconciliation. Those directly involved in his father's execution were punished, some tried, and executed, others exiled, but the vast majority of former parliamentarians were spared. England, he declared, must look forward, but restoration did not mean returning to the old ways entirely. Though the monarchy was back, it now operated in a changed landscape. The divine right of kings had been discredited. Parliament had tasted power and would never again be merely ceremonial. Religious divisions remained unresolved. The army was disbanded, but its legacy lingered in the minds of citizens who had seen what organized force could do. For Charles II, ruling meant navigating a delicate balance. He restored the Church of England, but resisted calls to reignite anti-Puritan persecution. He worked with Parliament, but sought to preserve royal prerogatives. He lived with the memory of his father's execution, always aware that the crown now rested on shakier ground than ever before. The Restoration also triggered a cultural shift. After years of Puritan rule, censorship, and moral austerity, English society erupted in celebration. Theaters reopened, music returned, art flourished, fashion became lavish. The king himself, charming, witty, and fond of pleasure, became the symbol of this new era. For many, the return of the monarchy felt like the return of life itself. Yet beneath the surface, tensions still simmered. Religious nonconformists remained marginalized. Republican ideas, though driven underground, had not disappeared. Questions about succession, the role of Parliament, and the limits of royal power would continue to haunt England for decades. But for the moment, there was peace. The Civil War, the execution of a king, the rise of Cromwell, and the creation of a republic had changed the political imagination of the English people forever. Never again would the monarchy rule without checks. Never again would Parliament be a passive observer. And never again would the idea of the king as unquestionable become unquestioned. In restoring the crown, England had not simply returned to the past, it had created a new future shaped by conflict, sacrifice, and hard-earned wisdom. Charles II had come home. The monarchy was back. But England would never be the same.